year, Bilahari Kosikin suggested that we might be bordering on reckless, was his word, for inviting him back a third time to speak at this conference. I'd argue that we would be reckless if we did not. We are so grateful that he's here once again for number 4. Fewer public officials, current or former, are as shrewd observers of foreign affairs than Bilahari, the former permanent secretary for Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In nearly 4 decades at the ministry, he has served both here and abroad, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation and as permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He also spent a considerable time in D.C. His informed and no-holds-barred commentary is both instructive and refreshing. I think you'll find it so. It's also why we love to reserve the last word for him. So please welcome Bilahari.
Thank you. That was far too kind an introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay, because I'm always in a dilemma. If I have a handheld mic, I feel I ought to sing. And I'm sitting on this high chair, which I thought I must because the camera can't see me otherwise. I feel I ought to have a drink in my hand. This is because it's like a bar stool. All right. Anyway, thank you for inviting me again. Since this is the 4th time, it is now confirmed you are reckless beyond redemption. Right? Because it is the 4th time, I thought I would take a slightly different approach. I will talk about the issues of the day, the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, and of course U.S.-China competition. But I want to frame it slightly different in terms of observations I've made, primarily from your profession, but not only your profession, including increasingly too often academics and public officials too, diplomats, intelligence officers, and so on. And I'm going to make 2 observations, and I try to be as brief as I can so that we can have maximum time for discussion. First of all, I think I've noticed increasingly all these groups of people, journalists, public officials, academics, pundits of all kinds, they generally pay far too much attention to events and not enough attention to the processes in which events are necessarily buried. Now, of course, you have to pay attention to events, because, but you need to see events in a certain perspective in order to present them accurately. Ever since the war in Ukraine broke out, there a certain apocalyptical note has crept into a lot of reporting, not just by journalists, but by academics, and indeed in policy papers made by public officials, as if the end of the world is nigh, or the world as we know it is nigh, right? I'm not saying that the war in Ukraine and the other wars, the war in the Middle East, these are not consequential events. Of course they are consequential events. But are they unusual events? I don't think they are unusual events. Conflict or competition, and therefore at least the possibility of conflict, and very often real conflict, are inherent characteristics of international relations. They are never absent from international relations. It's whether we choose to focus on them or not. It's often said this war in the Ukraine is the biggest war that has occurred in Europe since the Second World War, and probably that's true. Although there was a small unpleasantness, which is much nastier than this war in some respects in the Balkans in the mid-90s. Don't forget that. Huh? Much nastier because it was a genocidal conflict. And there has been conflict in the Sudan. There's been conflict in the Democratic Republic, DRC, of Congo. For how many years? Maybe 50 years? Half a century. How many millions have died there? I can't know. I don't know. I was looking up some figures, and now you can only get estimates. Yet nobody cares. Why? Because in Europe, I put it once in a much more crude way, and some European ambassadors were deeply offended, but they could not. No, I don't care about offending them. I said, "Can you refute me?" And they couldn't. I said, "It's only unique in that for the first time in a very long time, not so long if you take for the Balkan Wars, white people are killing white people instead of white people killing brown people or encouraging brown people to kill each other. If you want to put it very crudely, that is what makes this Ukraine war unique, right?" He didn't have much to say about that, except he said it's kind of racist. I said, yeah, because, the world is racist. I'm sorry. We don't like it. We should fight against it. But, the factor of race in international relations is a factor seldom discussed. So these wars, we should see them in perspective. Conflict is an inherent quality of international relations. Doesn't make them less horrendous, but we should not think of that the end of the world is nigh. And that brings me to another point of perspective. The world order that seems to be threatened now was never uncontested. When we talk about world order, somehow unconsciously, we think of something that commands consensus. But there is no world order that has ever commanded consensus, total consensus, or even substantial consensus. What we now call, or some countries call, the liberal international order, which, by the way, wasn't so liberal to those who were not in agreement with it or its fundamental tenets, was never uncontested. There was this small unpleasantness called the Cold War. And that was a contest over one conception of international order. And we lived with it. It was often very dangerous. It was very messy. But that was the only order we knew for 40 years or more. It was only a very short, historically exceptional period of about 20 years from the time the Berlin Wall came down to maybe the time the global financial crisis broke out, where one conception of international order seemed unchallenged, but it wasn't really unchallenged. I mentioned the Balkan Wars. That was a challenge. I mentioned the wars in Africa. There was a genocidal conflict in Rwanda, which nobody talked about. And more than that, very fundamental premises of that seemingly natural order of things was challenged by Islamic jihadists in the form of Al-Qaeda and other such things, who challenged not just the premises of their order, but the premises of modernity, culminating in 9/11, the terrorist attacks. Right? Now that short period, about 20 years or so, was extremely beneficial to most countries in the world, including Singapore, including China, including, I would guess, most of the countries from which you come, right? But just because it's beneficial does not mean it is any less exceptional or that it can be replicated. It can't be replicated. What we are seeing today is a return to normalcy. The problem is many of the policymakers or the commentators today grew up, professionally at least, during the exceptional period, and they got very comfortable with the exceptional period and mistake that exception for the norm. And so they are still somewhat discombobulated and yet to find their bearings, right? But, I say this idea of return to the norm not as a counsel of despair. Actually, it's a counsel of optimism and hope. Because all our countries, certainly mine, you see all this out there, all this was developed during that period of contestation. At least the foundations of it was laid. And all the countries that rapidly developed, within that contestation, the companies that flourished and grew large also grew up during that contestation. So what we have done before, we can do again. So we should not despair. In fact, I remind people of this perspective as a message of optimism and hope, not of despair. Now, my second point, a broad point, is we often are horrified by the humanitarian consequences of what I said is a normal state of affairs, which is war. Right? And you can see it. You can see it in Ukraine. You can see it well, you see it, but you don't want to see it in most of Africa. And you can see it, of course, in the Middle East. And I'll use the Middle East as my second example. There's no doubt the war in Gaza is horrific as the attack on Israel on 7 October that sparked it off, right? But let me tell you, there's something about this, and the war between Iran and Israel is also horrific. But all those wars, and one resulted from the other. The Iran-Israel war is a consequence of Israel's war against Hamas. It's one process. And it's not over yet, by the way. This ceasefire is fragile, and it's going to be a ceasefire with Middle Eastern characteristics. In other words, both sides are going to cheat. Right? And in fact, I think the possibility of this war, a conflict breaking out, is much higher because the initial damage assessment to Iran's nuclear program, as reported by New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post this morning, is not as great as people had expected or hoped. I don't think it'll take some time more before we really have a more accurate damage assessment. But okay, if it's not as great as people hope, that means if there are any surviving centrifuges, and people say there may be a few, so even and when the stockpile is located, the war will start again, right? Maybe with America or maybe without America, but certainly with Israel. With the support, by the way, of the Arab countries, the Sunni Arab countries, who are totally hypocritical about this thing. Okay. Now, anyway, but that's not my main point. What makes this war, horrific as it may be, whether over Gaza or between Iran, different from every other Middle Eastern war, with the possible exception of the war in 1948 when Israel was formed? I tell you what makes it different. Every other war, the concern of the world was that it would spark a wider global configuration, right? Because now that possibility is zero. Why? Because which are the external powers that are going to get involved? The only one that is going to make a difference is the United States, right? China's Middle Eastern strategic policies, the economic actor, is largely performative. And Russia has got its hands full in Ukraine. So, as horrific as this will be, and I repeat, it's not going to be the end of the story, this is going to remain a regional conflict. It may spread within the region a little bit if the Iranians are foolish enough to try to block the Straits of Hormuz. And I think it would be a deep mistake for them, but they have made a series of mistakes since 7 October with the results we now see. Right? So I can't rule it out, but even if that happens, it's a regional conflict. And what it will mean is the destruction of the Iranian Navy, what's left of it. Right? So it's going to be a regional conflict. And I think, in other words, its geopolitical significance, regardless of the humanitarian horror of any war, is going to be limited. Right? And yet I saw every damn article I have read for the last 2 years, since the war in Gaza started, was always in a slightly hysterical note of this becoming a wider war. That there will be an attack on Iran was inevitable. But that's still a regional war. Right? Again, I saw there was always a note that this is going to reorder the Middle East. Is it really reorder the Middle East? Yeah, to some degree, because Iran has been exposed as completely ineffectual in defending its own borders. Its instruments, Hezbollah and Hamas, have been destroyed as coherent military forces. But is that a fundamental reordering of the Middle East? I don't think so. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but we can discuss it. And in all this kind of semi-hysteria, the most important story of the Middle East is missed. Or it's not completely missed, but, it's been crowded out. What's that important story? That important story is the efforts of Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf states, but Saudi Arabia is the most important one, to remake their economies, which necessarily entails remaking their societies, which necessarily entails a reconceptualization of their religion, the place of their religion in society. That is happening as we speak, and that is, in the long run, whether they succeed or they fail, I think of greater consequences to the Middle East and the larger Ummah, the Muslim world, than these wars. Right? So, my point, again, I repeat, is we have to see things in perspective, and we have to see things in order to report on events, whether as a journalist, as a public official, as a academic. We have to see things in perspective. Otherwise, we either exaggerate, or usually exaggerate. I've been doing a lot of, ever since the Ukraine war, one of the joys of being retired is you only do what you feel like doing, you don't have to do, in any job, 90% of your job is things that you must do whether you like it or not. So, and one of the things I do is give talks to, not just talks to people like you, but to financial institutions. And I always begin by telling them, I'm really amazed that people who make decisions concerning hundreds and millions of dollars, if not billions, have decided willfully, until it was not possible to do it, to ignore the geopolitical factors in the world. Yet they have always been there. And because it's always been there, and because of the reason, they overreact. They usually overshoot one way, and then they overcorrect, and the markets gyrate. My last point, actually, is a market point, which has to do with the Middle East. Oh, sorry, this is my second last point. How much has the oil price moved in the last 2 years? There have been spikes, but it's remained pretty constant in the Brent crude, at least, in the mid 75, 76 US dollar range. And that's, to me, quite remarkable. It says quite a lot about the energy market, and it says quite a lot of what the markets think about the geopolitical impact of this conflict. Now, my real final point is, one of the biggest stories that was reported at the time, but people have lost interest in it because they think it's no longer a story, but I think differently, is the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War, I told you, fundamentally was the only order we knew for about 40 years. And its ending was a profound consequence. And we are still seeing the effects, and I think we'll still see the effects for some time. There's been a lot of also fairly hysterical reporting, sometimes very justified, about the new US administration led for the second time by Mr. Donald Trump. But how do you understand the Trump phenomenon? To me, Mr. Donald Trump is the first truly post-Cold War American president. Why do I say that? Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US faces no existential threat anywhere in the world. China is a formidable competitor, but they are both part of one single global system, which I do not believe can bifurcate into two separate systems as existed between the US and the Soviet Union. It's just too complex. And besides, the US and China are both essentially the same kinds of economy. They are both mixed. It's no longer a contest between a system based on a market economy, basically, and its political consequences, and a system based on a planned economy. Every economy is now a mixed economy. The difference in the degree, the different balances between the mixture between the planned and market elements. Although in the West, you do not like to talk about planning, so you talk about regulation instead. It's the same thing to my mind. Right? So they are competing within a single system, and there can be a very fierce competition, and we haven't seen the end of it yet, but it's not an existential competition. The object is not for one system to replace another. And in the West, at least, too much attention is placed to what I consider an epiphenomenal thing, the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. There are differences, but there are many versions of democracy, and there are many versions of authoritarianism. So that is not the core issue. There is going to be continued strategic competition between the US and China, but this is not a new Cold War. Because the Cold War was a systemic competition between two systems to see which is the better way of organizing modern industrial society. We know the answer to that now. As I said, all are mixed economies with minor differences between the balance between planned and market elements. Russia is certainly an existential threat to Ukraine and perhaps to some European states. But is it an existential threat to America? I don't think so. Ditto North Korea, it can be a regional threat. Ditto Iran even. So if America faces no existential threat, why should it, to quote JFK at the height of the Cold War, which was an existential struggle, why should America bear any burden, pay any price, fight any foe to uphold its idea of world order? In other words, it's time to put America first. Actually, every damn country in the world puts itself first. America is not in retreat by putting itself first. It's just going to be much more discriminating and transactional and narrow in the way it defines its interests and the way it engages the world. And that's a new reality that I think us in Asia generally accept much better, and those in Europe are only beginning to accept. I have been telling Europeans that we have had our Ukraine moment half a century ago, when the Americans thought that the war in Vietnam wasn't worth the candle, and therefore said, I have no vital interest in Vietnam, and I'm out of here. And I'm not out of the region, but I'm not going to get involved in ground wars. I'm going to be the offshore balancer. That's what happened in Afghanistan a few years ago. It's still in the region, in Middle East. It's still in fact, the only influential external actor, as we can see from the last 2 years. And its behavior since the Gaza war started has been classic offshore balancer behavior. And sooner or later, it's going to happen in Europe. Sometimes Mr. Trump, in his first campaign, he asked very profound questions. Perhaps it's an accident that he asked profound questions, but they're nonetheless profound. He asked, why are American troops in Germany? Now, that's a very good question. Why are American troops in Germany? Right? So I think it is a matter of time that America will move to an offshore balancing role in Europe, as well as it has done in Asia half a century ago, as it has done a few years ago in the Middle East, and will do in Europe. And the Europeans are completely shocked by this because they have not processed it. Right? Those in Asia and the Middle East, we have always dealt with the Americans on the basis of common interests, not on the illusion of having common values. Right? And that goes for American allies in Asia too, and American allies in the Middle East too. Ask any Israeli, he doesn't believe that they share they share many common values with America, but not totally. Right? So I think we'll all have to get used to a different America. It's not an American retreat, but it will be America that is much more transactional. There's going to be America that's going to demand more of not just its allies, but its partners and its friends. And, this is a new reality that we need to get used to. And I don't see this being reported. I see too much being reported about Trump's unique personality. I'm being polite here. It's okay. He's not a very likable person. That's an understatement, by the way. But he represents something much larger, a fundamental shift in how America engages the world. And actually, he is an extreme version. Every post-Cold War president from Clinton, with George W. Bush as a slight exception because of 9/11, the main priority has been domestic. For Clinton, it was healthcare. Okay, it didn't work out too well. George W. Bush, I told you, because of 9/11, right? When Obama talked about change, he wasn't talking about change abroad, he was talking about change in America. At least that's how I read him. And what's the big difference between Make America Great Again, that's Trump, and Biden's Build America Back Better? What's the big difference? One is a bit more polite than the other, right? And Mr. Biden was more consultative than Mr. Trump, certainly. But don't forget, he's not consulting you to ask, hey, how's your family doing? The kids doing okay and all that. He's consulting you to see what you're prepared to do for him to advance American strategic interests. In other words, it's polite transactionalism. Long ago, I read an American theologian and political philosopher by the name of Reinhard Niebuhr. Reinhard Niebuhr made a very crucial point. He said that Americans have immense power, but they are very uncomfortable with using their power in pursuit of their national interests, and therefore they have always felt it necessary to wrap up their interests in ideas of larger moral significance. And Americans are very good at wrapping. What Mr. Trump has done is rip the wrapping off. Unilateralism, distrust of multilateralism, use of force and threats of use of force, and all the things we don't like about Mr. Trump are not his inventions, They've always been there in American foreign policy. Until he decided to do reciprocal tariffs. And I don't think this is a sustainable policy, so it's being modified as we speak. The most disruptive thing any American has ever done was not done by Mr. Trump. It was done in August 1971 by Richard Nixon when overnight, without consulting any of his allies, he destroyed a central pillar of the Bretton Woods system by taking America unilaterally off the gold peg, right? So, the shining city on the hill have always cast a dark shadow. This is not evident to people who live on the hill, but it's certainly been evident to people who live under the hill. But America is still indispensable to maintain balance. It's going to be harder to persuade them to do it because they will be more transactional in defining their interests. But how can you have a balance against Russia for Europe without America at least minimally at your back? And therefore Europe will eventually have to do whatever America decides it wants it to do. How can you balance China without America present? And therefore America will make demands on its allies, its partners, its friends, and you will have to decide. You don't have to do everything they ask, but you will have to do some things they ask, and it's for every country to decide what they are willing to do. Now, on that cheerful note, I'll end and take your questions. Don't look so glum. I told you I was meant to be optimistic. We'll survive worse so we can get through this.
I have to say that was pretty grim.
It's not grim. It's a message of cheer and optimism. We've gone through worse and we are still here. Yep. Can you tell me who you are, please?
Frank from Thai Public Broadcasting.
Okay.
Given that you talk about China right now, United States right now, trying to moving back their maybe troops from Europe, maybe in the Asia to
from South Korea they will.
Yeah, how concerned you're about the regional conflicts in Asia, no matter it's Taiwan, China, or South China Sea, in ASEAN, would that regional conflicts in the Middle East really spark any fire in the region?
No, I don't think so. First of all, the Taiwan is completely different from any of the conflicts in the Middle East or the Ukraine. Circumstances are different. Secondly, you look at the Ukraine conflict and you look at the Ukraine conflict, right? There's a very fundamental factor in international relations that we in Asia don't think about enough. That's the nuclear factor. Nuclear weapons are stabilizing. They prevent conflict between countries that have them. India and Pakistan have gone to war twice, but they never escalated. The first time Pakistan took a great walloping but they didn't escalate. The second time, most recently, India took slightly less walloping, but they didn't escalate. Trump took credit for it, but actually I know that both India and Pakistan, the militaries were in constant contact. And so nuclear weapons are stabilizing. I don't believe that China and US will go to war as a matter of design. In other words, as an instrument of policy of the kind that Mr. Putin was trying to do in Ukraine. The risk in our region is of accidents getting out ahead. And even there, I think that that risk can be managed. Taiwan is slightly different, but there, I think, anybody from Taiwan here? Which newspaper? New York Times, that doesn't count. Okay, you're still the New York Times. You got your own problems, but it's not Taiwanese problem, all right? Okay, I tell you what, I go to Taiwan pretty often, and in fact, I'm going there in a couple of weeks again. And I am increasingly concerned about cross-strait relations, but I'm concerned on the Taiwanese side. First of all, there is a lack of will to defend themselves, and there's a great sense of entitlement that somebody is going to defend me. I don't know whether you have the same impression. Right? They like to announce this huge, I was just there a couple of months ago, and I told some fairly senior people, there's no point you telling me about your new defense budget, how big it is, when it's stuck in the legislative yuan. And there's no point telling me, this kind of logjam is characteristic because we are a democracy. I say, yeah, you are a democracy. That's good for you. Well done, But surely, faced with this threat, even democracies can have a minimal consensus on this very vital issue of a defense budget. And if you can't do that, you cannot expect anybody else to believe that you're really serious about your defense. And I can tell you many other stories why they're not serious about defense. At the same time, there's this huge sense of entitlement that because I have chips and so on, and I'm so important to the world economy and I'm such a nice democracy, somebody must defend me. This does not compute, So that leads to miscalculation on the Taiwanese side, which leads to there will be action-reaction syndrome. And that will be harder to control because it's a much more emotional issue than South China Sea or East China Sea and so on. That is my concern about our region. And China, I don't think, China has got huge problems of its own, and I actually don't see, there are systemic problems. We can talk about that later if you want, and I actually don't see there are any solutions to them. They are long-term problems, but they are nonetheless very deep problems.
Go ahead.
Hello. Okay, that works. I'm Ara from AFP in Manila.
Okay.
So my question is also on this topic of the South China Sea dispute. You mentioned that you're not really, you don't think that it's going to erupt into like a wider conflict, especially between like the US and China. But just curious in like what your view is on the recent like escalations of conflict, particularly between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. China's presence has increased in the disputed waters in recent years, and there have been accidents in the past year concerning Philippine civilian officers there and China's Coast Guard. And maybe like the U.S. role in that. We do have a mutual defense treaty with the U.S. So how is that all going to play out?
Okay. Nobody is going to make the Chinese give up their claims or dig up those artificial islands that they are constructing and throw the sandbag in the sea. On the other hand, the Chinese cannot stop the US operating in, through, and over the South China Sea. So there is basically a strategic stalemate, and that's good enough. It's not ideal, but it's good enough. In other words, we can move through the South China Sea. Those of us, I come to people like Philippines that have claims. That's slightly different. Trading countries like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, we have no claims. We can move through the South China, Thailand for that matter too, not by the leave and favor of any country, but as a matter of right, because there is a balance of power, right? And I think that balance will hold. Now, the claimant states have not had to give up their claims also because of their balance of power. You mentioned Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. Have you read it? then you know there's nothing about mutual defense in it except in the title. Right? I hope your president has read it, because sometimes I wonder, I wonder whether he has read it, because, it's only about 8 or 9 articles long, right? So it's very easy to read, but it has nothing about mutual defense except in the title. It commits the US only to consult and if there's a common threat, and perhaps take action in accordance with its constitutional procedures. Meaning, it's a political decision whether to get involved or not. And now, Philippines has been suffering at the hands of China. I know all that's happening. Yeah, but the point is the Philippines has no navy, has no air force worth talking about. That is why the Chinese pick on you. And the Americans are not going to help you. The Vietnamese, who also got claims, have been doing quite much more serious things than the Philippines has ever done. They are also reclaiming islands. They are disputed. And the Chinese have done nothing. Why? Because the Vietnamese have a credible military. You need a credible military to hold your own. You can't defeat China, but you make them more cautious. They are not cautious with the Philippines because they know you don't have any capability to respond. And I think the Chinese have correctly assessed that it is at best even odds, probably less than even odds, whether the Americans are going to come to your aid. Those little specks of dust are very important to the claimant states. They are not important in the larger strategic picture. So nobody is going to go to war over them. Not for your sake, or not for Malaysia's sake, or Brunei's sake, or anybody's sake. So this is the hard reality of the fact. You need to build up your capabilities. You only recently have begun to do so. You still don't have much of an air force. You still don't have much of a navy. You need at least that will create certain caution on the part of China. Vietnam has that. That's why they are a bit more cautious in dealing with Vietnam than the Philippines.
Hi, this is Ravi from the Indian Express. So I wanted to understand your views if India can rely on the new US administration for its long-term interests, because we have had an anti-China stance for quite some time now. And there has been a conflict with Pakistan, there has been a conflict with China, and our relationship with Bangladesh is also suffering because of Chinese influence in that region. So can we really depend on the US to,
Firstly, I don't think your relationship with Bangladesh is suffering only because of Chinese influence. You're not being very nice to the Bangladeshis yourself, right? In fact, India as a big power has not been very nice to all its neighbors from time to time. Okay, so let's get this in proportion too. As a small country, I see all big countries with a certain jaundiced eye, and I like India, and I go there often, right? So let's get this. Let's get a sense of perspective also on this. Secondly, you don't rely. I don't think the India relies on the US. You have improved your relationship with the US for strategic reasons, but India, generally speaking, has a long history on relying only on itself, right? And you are not having a bad relationship with China to do US a favor, right? You have a strained relationship with China because you have disputes in the Himalayas, because there's an old Chinese saying, one mountain can only have one tiger. Okay, right? And you too, in a different way, need to build up your capabilities, and you are doing it, right? So I don't think the US is you have improved your relationship with the US for a very simple reason, not just China. A much more fundamental reason is for several consecutive Indian governments, after Nehru, you basically threw your lot in with the Soviet Union, right? You had good reasons for doing it, but there's no more Soviet Union, right? So you still maintain a relationship with Russia, but it's not going to help you in any way. So it's perfectly logical. So I'm often asked this question: is the US reliable? And I also ask, I always answer the same way. I mean, of our country, we have a very close defense relationship with the US. And I've often asked this question, and I always answer, of course the US is not reliable, but it's indispensable. So whether it's reliable or not is moot. It's up to me to find a way to work with the US. How can it be reliable when every 4 years everything is turned upside down, even if the same party is returned to power, occupies the White House? But that is the US system. There's only one US, and that one US is indispensable. So we need to find a way to work with it. And so far, we have always found a way to work with it, and India will too. You don't depend on the US to defend you, surely? I don't think so. I know you don't. We don't depend on the US to defend ourselves. We only depend on the US to maintain the overall balance of power in the region in its own interest, not as a favor to us. And I think India has a similar attitude. And to sell us some weapons that we cannot produce ourselves, mainly advanced fighter aircraft. You have made a different choice. You're buying Rafales, okay? But, I don't think India relies on the US to defend it. I know you don't.
Hi, this is Masum Billah from the Business Standard based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I have two questions.
No wonder you were laughing when I said okay.
We can relate to that.
That's a different issue, I'm sure.
Anyway, so I have two questions. One, Bangladesh under Professor Yunus, the interim government, they are reaching out to Malaysia's Anwar Ibrahim and others to become to explore the possibility to be a part of the ASEAN. So, do you think
the answer is no?
Ever come possible?
No. We already made one mistake by admitting Timor-Leste, and we don't want to compound the mistake. Okay.
Okay. I can answer, yes. Yeah, so my second question is about the Rohingya situation in Cox's Bazar. So it's been going on for like years, and the Myanmar situation.
Decades.
Yes. I mean, in 2017 it got only worse.
Yeah.
So the Myanmar situation also got even more complicated, especially right across the border of Bangladesh in Rakhine State. So, do you think that the ASEAN can take a more assertive or active role in the repatriation or the overall situation in Myanmar?
What do you expect ASEAN to do? We have neither carrots nor sticks, right? We can only talk to the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, and we stupidly decided not to talk to them, right? With the result entirely predictable that ASEAN is split on this. Thailand has to talk to them because they got a long border, 4,400 kilometers or more, if I'm not mistaken. And you have got maybe 1 million or more Myanmar in Thailand, legally, illegally, refugees, things. So ASEAN is split on this issue. They made a fundamental mistake. It was not a wrong thing for ASEAN to set certain standards that we expect members to comply with, right? But those were clearly going to be aspirational. Because if the Myanmar military was a kind of organization that was willing to talk to its political opponents, not use force against its political opponents, they won't have pulled a coup in the first place, right? And we have, there were coups in Thailand, why didn't we shun them? There may be another coup in Thailand, right? Well, I don't know, you maybe know better, but the thing is falling apart. So what are we going to do? Shun Thailand? Of course not, right? So we made a very stupid mistake over Myanmar. And because I keep telling people, we have no carrots, we have no sticks. We can only talk to them. You say you cannot attend my meetings until you do all these things which are impossible. Then you can't even talk to them. And even you talk to them, why should they listen to you when you say, I don't want to talk to you, right? So what's going to happen is, in a few months or years, there will be some election in Myanmar. It will be neither free nor fair. But many ASEAN countries, with a great air of relief, will say, oh, now you're okay, come back. Right? No, there is no solution. Myanmar has been in a state of high intensity or low intensity civil war ever since it's been independent around the borders. This is a little bit worse than the previous, but I do not believe the rebels can overthrow the government, nor can the government completely eradicate the insurgents. So yeah, it's going to be in this state forever. But you know what's the most interesting thing about Myanmar? This latest phrase, nobody cares except the immediate neighbors. All the major powers don't care. Because why? It's of no strategic value anymore. I don't think Myanmar is going to fall totally in the Chinese camp because the Tatmadaw distrust the Chinese deeply. They have also hedged by the biggest weapon supplier now is Russia. So it will be in this mess for the foreseeable future. And more than that, nobody cares about the Rohingya. The Muslim countries in ASEAN pretend to care. But how many have they taken? They would like them all to go back to Bangladesh. That's the hard fact, right? They take a few symbolically because, sometimes, when you talk about how great Islamic country you are and so on, like Anwar Ibrahim is fond of doing, right? For internal votes or just to, for bragging rights, take some, right? Okay. But everybody would rather they just go back to Bangladesh. Since the Myanmar don't want them. Okay. Sorry, you are in a very bad position. All right.
Right over here.
Hi, I'm Rachel from The Wire China. Hi.
For which one? Wire.
Rachel, The Wire China. I'm
Okay,
from Hong
yeah,
Kong.
no, okay. I subscribe to the Wire.
Thank you. I do want to ask, where do you think the China-US strategic rivalry is going to go, and where does that leave countries in the region? Do they increasingly have to take a side?
That's two different questions. Okay. First of all, as I said, strategic rivalry between major powers is normal. Sometimes it's going to be high intensity, sometimes it's going to be low intensity. I think war by design can be avoided because of nuclear deterrence. And I think even accidents can be contained. But it's going to go on. It's a new structural reality of international relations. The reason why did the US and China come to some accommodation in 1972? They came to some accommodation because they had a common enemy, the Soviet Union. No Soviet Union, well, the natural dynamics of human nature and international relations reasserted themselves, right? So I think this is a long-term issue. It's not going. There may be a deal between China and in the U.S. on trade. I don't think the tariff policy is sustainable. But are you Americans in this room? You're all very lucky. Any Americans in this room, I know there's some. I'm not talking about you.
I saw you pointing at us, right?
Okay. Americans, and I'm pointing at him. Americans, I tell my American friends, you're very lucky because you have a president with no sense of shame. Because whatever happens, he will say, this is what I wanted in the first place. And it's a great victory. So that's good. We should encourage him, all right? Okay. There are two nightmare scenarios for countries in the world, actually, and particularly in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. One is, of course, that the US and China go to war. Then you have no room to maneuver. The other, of course, if they come to complete agreement. Once upon a time, we were worried about G2 world. Remember that quaint idea? Okay. I don't think that's very likely or the other. So some level of tension creates maneuver space, right? Possibly right now there's too much tension, so it's going to be harder to maneuver, but I don't think it's impossible. Right? When we say we don't want to choose, we say it too often probably, we don't really explain what we mean by it. So let me try to explain, and I think this is a general Southeast Asian attitude and probably general East Asian attitude. But I'll explain with regard to Singapore, right? We don't mean we want to be neutral because it's impossible. How can you be neutral, right? Because neutrality is not something you can unilaterally declare. It has to be respected by other sides, right? And while the US and China both say that they don't want to make people choose. Nobody believes them. Okay, right? We don't mean either. Excuse me.
Bless you.
It's not contagious. Don't worry. I have an allergy. We don't mean either that we want to be equidistant, because what the hell does that mean anyway? And we can't be neutral with regard to our own interests. So what we mean is that we will follow our interests in whichever direction they take us. And we don't need to align our interests across all domains in one direction or the other. For example, with Singapore, unless you have been living under a rock, as far as defense and security is concerned, you should know, everybody should know, we have chosen very long time ago. And we're not very likely to change our choice, right? That does not mean we cannot have a kind of relationship with the PLA, for example, the SAF. Yes, but it's a very minor relationship. It's performative, because we don't want to reveal our doctrine, nor do we want to expose the weapons that the US is kind enough to allow us to buy from them to the PLA, because then we will not be able to get those weapons in the future, right? But in the domain of defense and security, we are basically chosen, not just the US, but the West generally. On the other hand, in certain political attitudes, for example, this idea that some ideas are claimed to be universal, and that gives some other countries a voice in how we order our internal affairs. Our general attitudes are much closer to those of China, and indeed of Russia, right? But in the case of, like, say, economics, then, we are completely promiscuous, we'll go in any damn direction where it is in our advantage, and, law and prudence permitting. You have to balance off, of course. If you go and start helping China assess very high-end semiconductors, sooner or later you're not going to get the F-35. So we'll have to create those balances, but it's not impossible to create those balances. That is how most of Southeast Asia has lived for most of history, because we have always between major powers, and here we are. All this was created. You look at it, this is all unnatural, it should not exist. All this was created when the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union was hot in Southeast Asia. And when every Southeast Asian country that originally formed ASEAN, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, all of us face China-supported communist insurgencies. Right? But here we are. So it's not impossible. We just have to keep calm, maintain a sense of perspective, and maintain the ability to assess your interest in a cold-blooded way. My first foreign minister, when I was a very young officer, was very fond of saying, every country has two foreign policies, a foreign policy of words and a foreign policy of deeds. And you should never confuse the foreign policy of words for the foreign policy of deeds. If you do that, it's suicidal. And that means being rather cold-blooded. And that's why I started with these ideas about perspective, and what is of geopolitical significance is not the same as what of humanitarian disaster. That is sentimental and magical thinking. You need clinical thinking to navigate this much more complex environment. Unfortunately, it's in rather short supply these days around the world.
Christian, go ahead.
Hello, Christian Davies from the Financial Times, based in Seoul, in South Korea. Thank you so much. It was a brilliant presentation, and I agree with really all of your analysis, but I'm interested in your cold-bloodedness and lack of sentimentalism. We had an American speaker earlier in the program who was talking about US-China issues, and at one point he said that American public opinion turned against China whenever it was 10 years ago, purely because of what China had done. It was all Chinese behavior. And
you ask the Chinese, they will say, it's all American.
Right, right. And my reaction, of course, is thinking that isn't right, and it reminds you of the kind of lack of self-awareness, and you think about whatever, Vietnam, Iraq, all the different things that America has done over time and so on. And so your your analysis is a very good corrective to that. And so in that moment, I would have very much lent towards not just your intellectual analysis, but I think some of the underlying attitude behind it and some of the historical context behind it.
The underlying attitude behind it, why we think this way, or I think this way.
You've obviously, you don't get to the position you did in the Singapore Foreign Service without being extremely astute analyst and smart and so on.
You could be lucky too, you know.
Or lucky too. But as you said, you need to be a bit more clinical, less sentimental, and so on. And so the American sentimentalism can be grating, is the point I'm making. I agree with you. But on the other hand, I'm based in Korea, and I used to be based in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And in Korea, obviously, the division was cold power politics.
Yeah.
But there is a difference between South Korea and North Korea.
Yeah, of course.
And there was a difference between East Germany and West Germany. And it was interesting, something you said about the lack of competition and so on. Despite all of the Western hypocrisy, which I am aware of and occasionally have partaken in myself, it does feel that a world in which the more power Russia and China have means more people, in whatever continent, not just in the West, but in Asia too, living in countries that potentially look more like an East Germany or a North Korea than like a West Germany or a South Korea. And how do you avoid tipping too far into being too clinical and not recognizing that values do exist?
Oh,
they are
okay.
important.
No, values, there is this rather silly debate among international relations theorists about values versus interests. And I think it's very silly because values are an interest, right? And it's something you can be clinical about too, right? But, I think values, the idea that certain values are universal, that's a silly idea. Because the expression of values may be expressed in universal terms, but the implementation of those values, they will vary from country to country according to the circumstances. I think your concern, I understand it, but I think it's a bit overblown. I can't believe any country